The gun was already pressed against Cornelius Barlow's temple when Anna Dawson realized she had walked straight into a trap. She stood in the doorway of the Silver Spur Saloon, her chest heaving, the letter still crumpled in her fist. The letter that had promised her brother was alive. The letter that had lured her here, to this dim and reeking room in Caldwell, Kansas, on a blistering August afternoon in 1878. Dust motes hung in the yellow light. 3 men she did not recognize ringed the bar, and there, in the center of it all, Cornelius Barlow sat at a table with a revolver pressed to the side of his head by a man she recognized all too well, Victor Hale, her stepfather. "Close the door, Anna," Victor said pleasantly, as if she had just wandered in from a Sunday walk. His voice had that same smooth, buttery quality that had once fooled her mother into marrying him. It did not fool Anna anymore. It had not fooled her since the night she had found her mother's will, forged 3 years ago. "Let him go," Anna said. She did not move from the doorway. "She is bold," Cornelius said, his voice remarkably steady for a man with a gun at his head. His eyes cut toward her, and even in this moment of absolute terror, she noticed they were the most arresting shade of gray she had ever encountered. Storm clouds and iron. "I told you she would come." "You told him about me?" She stared at Cornelius. "I told him you were someone worth protecting," Cornelius said, and there was something in his voice that silenced the room. Victor pressed the gun harder. "Touching. Now, Anna, I believe you have something that belongs to me, the deed to the Dawson Ranch, the real one, and I am going to need you to hand it over before anyone in this room does something we all regret." She had not expected this. She had spent 3 weeks believing she was merely a widow's daughter, trying to reclaim land stolen from her family. She had not expected to walk into a room and find the one man who had, in the past 12 days, become something she could not name, sitting in the crosshairs of Victor Hale's fury. 12 days. That was all it had been. 12 days since she had stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, with $40 in her purse, a forged deed her stepfather had filed with the county clerk, and a secret document sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt. 12 days since she had collided, quite literally, with Cornelius Barlow on the steps of the Caldwell Hotel. She had been trying to drag a trunk that weighed approximately as much as a grown steer. He had been coming down the steps 2 at a time, hat pulled low, moving like a man who had somewhere important to be. They had connected at the hip, and the trunk had gone sideways, and Anna had gone with it, and she had landed in the red Kansas dust with her skirts around her knees and all the dignity she had carefully assembled on the 3-day stage ride evaporating in an instant. She had looked up from the ground. He had looked down at her. "Are you injured?" he had asked. "Only my pride," she had said, and he had laughed, and she had found herself laughing too, even though she had not laughed genuinely in nearly a year. He had lifted the trunk as if it were made of straw and carried it up the steps to the hotel without being asked. She had watched his shoulders and thought with some irritation that she was watching them. He had set the trunk down inside the lobby, turned and touched the brim of his hat. "Cornelius Barlow," he said, "I am a land surveyor among other things." "Anna Dawson," she said, "I am a woman trying to reclaim her family's ranch among other things." Something had shifted in his expression, not pity. Something more careful than that, more awake. "That is a complicated business in this territory," he said. "I know. Do you have someone helping you?" "I have myself," she said. He had looked at her for a long moment, and she had felt the peculiar sensation of being truly seen by a stranger, which was both alarming and more comforting than she wanted to admit. He had nodded once, replaced his hat, and gone back down the steps. She had told herself she would not think about him again. She had been wrong about that within the hour. She had gone to the county clerk's office that afternoon and asked to see the land records for the Dawson property, 700 acres of prime Kansas grazing land that her father, Thomas Dawson, had built from nothing over 20 years. Thomas had died of fever in the spring of 1875. Her mother, Eleanor, had married Victor Hale 6 months later, worn down by grief and the terror of managing the ranch alone. Eleanor had died less than a year after the wedding. The official cause was a weak heart. Anna had believed that for exactly 8 months until she had found the will. The will Victor had shown her, the one that left everything to him, had been written in her mother's hand. Except that Anna had the real will, the one Alina had written and hidden inside the family Bible, the one that left the Dawson ranch to Anna and her brother Daniel. The real will had been written in the same hand, yes, but the forged one had 2 tells. Alina had always crossed her 7s in the European fashion because her grandmother had been from Austria, and she had always spelled the word hereby as hereby, a quirk she had never bothered to correct. The forged will had perfectly crossed 7s in perfect spelling. Victor had been meticulous, but he had not known Alina well enough. Anna had taken the real will and the deed sewn into the hem of her skirt to 3 different lawyers before she found one willing to look at it honestly. His name was Mr. Finch, and he operated out of a cramped office in Caldwell, and he had told her that if she could produce the original deed and testimony from 2 witnesses to her mother's signature, she had a real case. The problem was the witnesses were afraid of Victor Hale. The other problem was that Daniel, her brother, 23 years old and stubborn as a Kansas mule, had gone to confront Victor 6 weeks ago and had not been heard from since. The letter that had arrived yesterday, the one purportedly from Daniel, claiming he was alive and held at the Silver Spur, had brought her here at a run. And here, improbably, was Cornelius Barlow. She had not seen him again after that first afternoon. Or rather, she had seen him once briefly on the street outside the post office, and he had raised his hat and she had nodded, and she had thought she felt his eyes on her back as she walked away, but had decided she was being fanciful. Later, she would learn that he had not been fanciful at all. He had been watching because he had asked around about her situation, and what he had learned had alarmed him deeply. Cornelius Barlow was, in fact, considerably more than a land surveyor. He had served with the United States Marshal's office for 4 years before a disagreement about methods had led him to resign. He had his own reasons for being in Caldwell, reasons that intersected with Anna's more directly than either of them had yet understood. Victor Hale's land fraud did not begin and end with the Dawson Ranch. There were 3 other families: the McKinney farm to the north, the Carver homestead, the Ray's family, who had been working that land since before Kansas was a state, whose claim was the oldest and the most flagrantly stolen. Victor had a network, a county clerk in his pocket, a lawyer who was not Mr. Finch, and at least 3 men willing to do what needed doing when the paperwork alone was not enough. Cornelius had been gathering evidence for 8 months. He had come to Caldwell specifically to present that evidence to a federal circuit judge who was due to pass through the territory in 2 weeks. What he needed was testimony. What he needed, specifically, was someone with a direct personal grievance who was willing to stand up in front of that judge and speak. When he had heard Anna Dawson's name and understood what she was doing in Caldwell, something had slotted into place with the quiet precision of a key in a well-oiled lock. He had gone looking for her the following morning and found her at the Land Records office, arguing with the clerk, who claimed that certain files were temporarily unavailable for review. They were available yesterday, Anna was saying, with a composure that was clearly costing her something. Rules change, the clerk said, not meeting her eyes. Cornelius had stepped up beside her and placed his surveyor's credentials on the counter. I have a federal survey order for all land records in this county going back 15 years, he said. I believe that supersedes any temporary unavailability. The clerk had gone pale and produced the files. Outside, afterward, Anna had looked at Cornelius with an expression that mixed gratitude and wariness in equal measure. Why did you do that? Because I believe in property rights, he said, and then, because she was clearly not the sort of person who accepted incomplete answers, he added, and because what is happening to your family is connected to something larger I have been investigating for some time. She stared at him. You know about Victor. I know about Victor, he said. I know about the McKinneys. I know about the Carver family and about the Ray's homestead. I have a file 2 inches thick. What I need is someone willing to testify." She studied him. He withstood it. He had noticed that first day that she had a way of looking at people that felt like an assessment rather than merely a glance. He would come to understand it was something she had developed out of necessity, the product of having trusted the wrong person, her stepfather, and watched it destroy her family. "What is your stake in this?" she asked. "You said you left the marshal's office." "I did." "Then who are you working for?" He was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, wagons and horses and the sound of the forge from 3 buildings down. "I am working for the people Victor Hale has robbed," he said. "And I suppose at this point I am working for my own conscience." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "All right, Cornelius Barlow, tell me what you know." They had spent the next 4 days in the back room of Mr. Finch's law office, spreading documents across a table the size of a wagon bed, cross-referencing land records and witness accounts, and the chain of title on properties across 3 counties. Cornelius was meticulous. He had a methodical, unhurried approach to information that Anna found both reassuring and, she admitted to herself only reluctantly, rather appealing. He never dismissed what she said. He asked questions that built on her answers. He treated her knowledge of her own family's history as primary evidence rather than mere sentiment. He was also, she noticed in unguarded moments, exactly the sort of man who occupied space in a room without demanding it. He was tall, dark-haired, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of lean strength that came from actual work rather than performance. He did not swagger. He did not perform. He simply was in a direct and uncomplicated way, and she found it profoundly restful after years of living with Victor Hale's elaborate performances of respectability. On the 3rd day, when they had been working past sunset and the lamp threw warm shadows across the office, she had looked up from a document to find him watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not the sort of look men gave women in this part of the world which tended toward appraisal. It was something quieter, more internal, as if he were working something out. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He seemed mildly surprised to be caught. "I was thinking that you are very good at this," he said. "You have a precise mind." "My father taught me to read contracts," she said. "He said a woman who could not read a contract was a woman waiting to be swindled." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was the best man I have ever known," she said, and her voice was steady but only just. He had not offered platitudes or condolences. He had simply nodded and returned to the documents, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she felt something shift slightly in her chest, the way ice shifts in early spring. On the 4th day, she had told him about Daniel. They had been walking back from the telegraph office, where she had sent another inquiry to a contact in Wichita who might have Daniel's whereabouts. The late afternoon light was honey-colored and heavy, and the dust on the main street of Caldwell caught it and turned amber. "He went to the ranch 6 weeks ago," she said. "He thought he could confront Victor directly. He is young and he is fearless, and those 2 things are sometimes a very dangerous combination." "How old is he?" 23. "He has been working on a cattle drive out of Texas. He sent me a letter saying he was coming home to deal with it himself, and I wrote back begging him to wait, but he had already gone by the time my letter arrived." She paused. "I have not heard from him since. His employer in Texas says he never returned after the job." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Victor would not want to draw the kind of attention that comes from a disappearance." "That is what I tell myself," she said, "but I do not know." He had stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. There was something careful in his expression, something that was weighing what to say against what she could bear to hear. "I think Daniel is alive," he said. "Victor is too calculating to make that kind of permanent mistake. It would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny he cannot afford right now with the judge coming, but I think he may be being held somewhere." "I have been thinking the same thing," she said quietly. "I am terrified that thinking it might mean I am letting hope cloud my judgment." "No," he said. "Your judgment on this is sound. I have been watching Victor's movements, and 3 weeks ago he started paying for lodging at a property outside town that he does not own. It may be nothing, but it may be where Daniel is. She looked at him. You have been watching Victor's movements for 3 weeks, since before you knew me. Yes. And you have not told the current marshal. The current marshal, he said with a flatness that conveyed considerable information, is Victor Hale's cousin by marriage. She absorbed this. So we are essentially on our own. We have Mr. Finch. We have the federal judge coming in 2 weeks. And we have, he said, looking at her steadily, each other. It was a simple and practical statement. She understood it as such. But she also felt it somewhere below the level of practicality, somewhere in the deeper register of things that mattered, and she had to look away at the amber dust in the street to compose herself. 2 weeks is a long time if Daniel is being held somewhere, she said. Then we do not wait 2 weeks to find him, Cornelius said. We use the time until the judge arrives to build the case, and we find Daniel as soon as we can. Over the following days, they built the case. They also, without either of them announcing it, built something else. It happened in the small, unannounced moments. He brought her coffee in the mornings when she was already at the documents, without asking, and always the right amount of sugar because he had noticed. She learned that he had grown up in Ohio, the son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had been a seamstress, that he had gone west at 19 with a surveying crew and discovered a talent for the law that had led him eventually, circuitously, to the marshal's office. He learned that she had been the practical one in her family, the one who kept the accounts and checked the fences and negotiated with buyers while her father's health declined, that she had wanted to study law herself but had had no means and no pathway in 1878 for a woman in Kansas. That is an injustice, he said simply, when she told him this. It is the way things are, she said. That does not make it less unjust, he said, and she found herself looking at him with a strange ache in her throat. He was not a man who talked about feelings directly. But he was a man who showed what he thought in 100 quiet, consistent ways, and she had begun to understand that language far better than she had expected to in 12 days. On the 8th day, they found where Daniel was being held. One of Cornelius's sources, a man who ran the livery stable east of town, and who had been feeding information to Cornelius for months out of his own sense of justice, reported that Victor's men were making daily food runs to the old Sheridan property, a disused farmstead 3 miles northeast. Cornelius had scouted it himself that afternoon and returned with the confirmation. There were 2 men posted outside, there were lamp lights in the back rooms at night, and through a far window he had seen the shadow of a figure pacing. We cannot go in with force, Cornelius said. 2 of us against at least 4 of them with Daniel as a hostage is not odds I am willing to play. Then how? Anna asked. We need a reason for them to move Daniel. If they move him, we can intercept during the transfer. He thought for a moment. Victor believes you have the original deed. He knows you are in Caldwell. He is going to make a move soon anyway. We can accelerate that. You want to use me as bait, she said. Absolutely not, he said, and the swiftness and firmness of it silenced her for a moment. I want to make Victor believe you are about to hand the deed to the federal judge's advance courier, who is supposed to arrive in Caldwell on Monday. If he believes the deed is about to be placed in federal custody, he will want to move Daniel because Daniel is his only real leverage over you. A moving target is easier to intercept than a guarded one. It was a good plan. It was also, she recognized, built around keeping her as far from personal danger as possible, and she was not sure whether to be grateful or offended. I want to be there when you intercept the transfer, she said. Anna, Daniel will be frightened and he will be more frightened if I am not there. He trusts me. She looked at him squarely. I am not asking your permission, Cornelius. I am telling you I will be there. The question is whether I will be there with a plan or without one. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set, and she could see that every instinct he possessed was pulling against what she was saying. But he was also, fundamentally, a man who respected what she was telling him about herself and her brother. With a plan, he said finally, but you stay back until Daniel is clear. That is the condition. Agreed, she said. The plan had worked precisely up to the point where it had not. Victor had received the rumor, planted carefully through two intermediaries, that Anna was meeting the federal courier on Monday morning. On Sunday afternoon, Victor's men had begun moving Daniel. Cornelius and Anna had been waiting in position at the crossroads northeast of town where any route from the Sheridan property had to pass. There had been a wagon. There had been Daniel, hands bound, looking thin and furious and alive, which had made Anna's eyes fill with tears she did not shed. Cornelius and the liveryman and a third person, a local farmer named Aldous Reyes, whose land Victor had stolen and who had agreed to help for reasons of his own, had come out of the tree line on three sides. What none of them had anticipated was Victor himself being in that wagon. Victor Hale was a careful man. He did not usually put himself in the field, but he had understood, apparently, that this was the end game, and he had decided to be present for it. He had been in the back of the wagon with Daniel, and when the interception happened, he had come out with Daniel as a shield and a gun, and in the confusion he had gotten away. Not with Daniel, whom Cornelius had managed to pull free in the scramble with a speed and decisiveness that had left Anna breathless, but Victor had gotten away, and he had taken two of his men with him, and he knew now that Anna had Daniel, which meant he had nothing to lose. The letter had arrived the following morning, delivered to her room at the hotel. It had said, in Victor's precise handwriting, "I know about the Surveyor. Bring the deed to the Silver Spur at 2 o'clock, or I will demonstrate to you what I am capable of." She had not told Cornelius. She had told herself she was protecting him. In truth, she had been afraid that if she told him, he would find a way to stop her from going, and she would not be stopped. Not with the deed in her hem and the chance to end this in her hands, which was how she had walked into the Silver Spur and found Cornelius already there with a gun to his head. He had, she understood now, been watching out for her even without being asked. He had known she might do something like this and had come ahead to scout. He had walked into the same trap from a different direction. "I will ask you one more time," Victor said. "The deed, Anna." Daniel was safe. He was at Mr. Finch's office with Aldous Reyes standing guard. The federal judge's advance courier was, in fact, due tomorrow morning, not Monday as the planted rumor had said. Cornelius had arranged that too, she would learn later. He had been 3 moves ahead, even when she thought she was the one making all the moves. Anna looked at Victor Hale across the dim room. She looked at the 3 men at the bar. She looked at Cornelius, who was watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and she saw in them not fear but something like absolute faith. She reached into the hem of her skirt. She produced the deed. She held it up so Victor could see it. Then she looked at the front door. It opened. The man who came through it wore a badge on his chest, a federal marshal's badge, and behind him were 3 deputies. The advance courier had arrived a day early. Cornelius had sent word 2 days ago. Cornelius had arranged everything, including the exact time this door would open. Victor Hale's face changed. The smooth, buttery pleasantness cracked like old plaster, and what was underneath was something cold and ugly and afraid. "Victor Hale," the marshal said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, forgery, and unlawful imprisonment. You will put down that gun." What happened next was very fast and very loud, and culminated in Victor Hale sitting on the floor of the Silver Spur with his hands in irons, 2 of his men likewise detained, and the third having bolted out the back and been apprehended in the alley by one of the deputies. Cornelius had a reddening mark on his temple where the gun had pressed, but was otherwise entirely unharmed. He had risen from the chair the moment the marshal entered and moved to Anna's side without a word and stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. She turned to look at him. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking. "You arranged all of this," she said. "Not all of it," he said. "You arranged quite a bit of it yourself. You sent word to the marshal 2 days ago." "I sent word 10 days ago," he said quietly. "When I understood what we were dealing with, I have been in contact with the federal office in Wichita since we met." She stared at him. "You planned this from the beginning." I planned for the possibility of this, he said carefully. Plans change. People are unpredictable. He paused. You are particularly unpredictable, she laughed. It came out slightly ragged, with the edge of tears still in it, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. He watched her with that same careful, awake expression she had come to recognize, the one that was not pity and not calculation, but something wholly more personal. Daniel is safe, she said. Daniel is safe, he confirmed. The deed is in my hand. The deed is in your hand. She looked down at the crumpled paper. It is over, she said, and her voice broke very slightly on the last word. He did something then that she would think about for a long time afterward. He reached out and put his hand over hers, the one holding the deed, not taking it or removing it, just covering it with his own. It was the most careful, considered gesture of comfort she had ever received. His hand was warm and calloused and entirely steady, and she felt the trembling in her own go still. They stood like that for a moment in the settling dust of the Silver Spur saloon, with the sounds of men in irons being marched out the door and the low voices of the marshal's deputies, and the amber afternoon light coming in through the filthy windows and turning everything to gold. "Thank you," she said. "You would have gotten here without me," he said. She considered this honestly. "Eventually," she said. "But it would have taken considerably longer, and I would probably have been shot at least once." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile yet. "At least once," he agreed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of law and paperwork and testimony, exactly the kind of meticulous, detail-heavy work that Anna was very good at. She appeared before Judge Harlan Westing, who arrived in Caldwell on Tuesday morning, a sharp-eyed man of 60 who had heard a great many stories of fraud in the territories and had not been softened by the experience but had been made very precise. Anna presented the original deed, the original will with its crossed sevens and its "hereby," and the testimony of Mr. Finch and of Daniel, who was pale but coherent, and who told the judge everything he had seen and heard during 6 weeks of captivity at the Sheridan property. Cornelius presented his 8 months of evidence. It was, Judge Westing said, the most comprehensive land fraud case he had reviewed in 15 years on the circuit. Victor Hale's legal claim to the Dawson Ranch was voided on the 3rd day of proceedings. The McKinney farm was returned to its family. The Carver homestead was restored. The Ray's family's title was confirmed, and Judge Westing made a point of noting in the record that their claim predated statehood and should never have been challenged. There was a moment when the judge read that portion of his ruling, when Aldous Ray's, sitting in the back of the courthouse, put his face in his hands. His wife, Lucia, took his arm and held it, and Anna watched them and felt the ache and rightness of it simultaneously. Victor Hale was remanded to federal custody and transported to Wichita to await trial. His associates were likewise detained. The county clerk who had been in his pocket resigned the following day and left Caldwell before anyone could formally charge him, which was not a satisfying outcome, but Mr. Finch believed they had enough to pursue him if they chose to, and he was already making inquiries. Anna had very little time during those 3 days to think about anything except the case, but she thought about Cornelius. She thought about him in the margins of things, in the moment between sleep and waking when the mind's guard is down, in the walk from the hotel to the courthouse when the morning air was cool and smelled of dust and wild grass. She thought about his hand over hers in the Silver Spur. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the table in Mr. Finch's back room on their 4th day, working, the lamplight on his face. She thought about the way he had said, "I want to be certain you are safe," and the way that had been different from the 100 other times men had said things that meant control. He had not told her what he felt. She had not told him either. They had been, in these 12 days and now these 3 days more, professional allies who had become something she could not categorize precisely, something that lived in a register below what had been spoken. On the 4th evening after the trial, the Dawson Ranch officially restored to her, and Daniel's ownership by the terms of the judge's ruling, Anna was sitting on the steps of the Caldwell Hotel in the blue dusk. Daniel had gone to the hotel dining room for supper. She had told him she would follow in a moment and had been sitting here for 40 minutes. She heard footsteps on the boardwalk and looked up. Cornelius came and sat down beside her on the steps without being asked. He had removed his hat and held it between his knees and looked out at the darkening street. "You should be celebrating," he said. "I am," she said, quietly. He glanced at her. "How does Anna Dawson celebrate quietly?" "By sitting very still and trying to believe it is real," she said. He was quiet for a moment. A wagon went by, its lamp swinging. Somewhere on the main street a door opened and closed and someone laughed. "It is real," he said. "I know." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I have been waiting for something this large to go wrong for so long that I am not certain how to proceed when it goes right." "That is understandable," he said. And then after a pause, "What will you do now?" "Go home," she said. "The ranch needs a great deal of work. Victor let it go to ruin in the year he held it. Daniel and I will have to rebuild the herd almost from nothing, repair the fences, negotiate with the bank about the back taxes Victor let accumulate." She paused. "It will take years." "But it is yours," he said. "It is ours," she agreed. "What will you do?" He turned the hat in his hands. "I was offered a position," he said. "Territorial Land Commissioner for the federal government, based out of Wichita primarily, but with work across the region." "That sounds like something you would be very good at," she said. "It sounds like it would take me through this part of Kansas fairly regularly," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the street. She looked at him. He was achingly careful about this, she thought. He would not impose himself on what she was feeling. He would not assume. He was sitting on the step beside her in the Kansas dusk and not looking at her and letting her decide what the space between them meant. "Cornelius," she said. He looked at her. She was not, she had decided in the 40 minutes before he sat down, going to be indirect about this. She had watched her mother be indirect about what she needed and had seen where that led. She was her father's daughter who had taught her to read contracts, and a contract required clarity. "I'm not ready to say goodbye to you," she said. Something moved in his face. Something that had been held very still released slightly. "I'm not ready to say goodbye to you either," he said. "I have been sitting with that fact for about a week." "And what were you planning to do about it?" "I was planning," he said, "to ask if I might write to you, from Wichita." "You were going to court me by letter," she said. "I was going to begin to court you by letter," he said, "and come back as often as I was able, and try to be patient, which is not something I find especially easy." She looked at him. "I have known you for 15 days. Yes. That is a very short time to be certain of anything." "Yes," he said again, "I am aware of that. But I think you should know that I am generally a very good judge of character," she said, and her voice had gone a little unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with grief or fear. "And in 15 days I have not once doubted yours." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is the most significant thing anyone has ever said to me," he said quietly. She breathed. The dusk was deepening around them, the sky going from blue to indigo, the first stars showing. "Write to me from Wichita," she said, "and come back." "I will," he said. "I promise you." The summer moved on, and the Kansas grass turned from green to gold to brown, and Anna and Daniel set about the enormous work of reclaiming the Dawson Ranch. The house needed a new roof in 2 places, and the south fence line had been entirely neglected, and a portion of the original herd, which Victor had sold off, needed to be replaced. Anna negotiated with the Caldwell Bank, who turned out to be considerably more willing to work with her now that a federal judge had restored her title, and arranged a loan at a reasonable rate. She hired 2 hands, brothers named Cal and Owen Mercer, who were hardworking and honest and who had heard about what had happened to the ranch and what Anna had done to get it back, and treated her with the kind of respect that felt genuine rather than performed. She also received letters from Wichita. The first arrived 10 days after Cornelius left Caldwell. It was 2 pages in a clear, precise hand and covered the journey from Caldwell, the state of the Territorial Commissioner's office in Wichita, a description of a particularly contentious land dispute he had been asked to review involving a railroad right-of-way, and one paragraph at the end that said, "I think about the Dawson Ranch in the late afternoon, when the light goes amber. I imagine you walking the fence line, checking your land. I find this image considerably more sustaining than it has any practical right to be." She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she wrote back. Her letter was longer than his. She described the roof repair and the fence line, and a disagreement with Daniel about which breed of cattle to restock with, which she had won. She reported on the merits of the argument. She described the Mercer brothers and Mr. Finch, who had become a friend, and a conversation she had had with Lucia Reyes, who had come by the ranch one afternoon and stayed for 3 hours, and whose children were numerous and delightful, and who had offered Anna the kind of frank, warm woman's friendship that she had not had since leaving the territory originally. She wrote in the last paragraph, "The south fence line is intact now. I walked it yesterday at dusk and thought of you saying that it is real. I am beginning to believe it fully." The letters continued. 2 a month from him, 2 from her, then 3 from him. Then the frequency began to blur into something more like a continuous conversation conducted at a distance, and she stopped counting. He came back in October. She saw him ride up the lane to the ranch house on a Tuesday morning when the oaks on the creek bank had gone red and gold, and the air had a bite to it that presaged the coming winter. She was in the yard hanging laundry, and she saw him at the end of the lane and put down the sheet she was holding and stood there watching him come. He dismounted at the gate and tied his horse and came through. He had been riding, she could tell, for some time. There was dust on his coat, and he looked tired in a way that meant miles rather than trouble. He took off his hat when he came through the gate. They looked at each other across the yard. "You are here," she said. "I said I would come back," he said. She went to him. It was not a calculated decision. It was simply where her feet took her, across the yard in the October morning, and she took his face in both hands and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the sheet she had put down turned gently in the wind in the yard behind them. He stayed for a week. He slept in the bunkhouse and worked alongside the Mercer brothers on the remaining fence repairs, and spent the evenings at the kitchen table with Anna and Daniel, talking about the land and the law and the future. Daniel, who had initially regarded Cornelius with the wariness of a younger brother who has been through an ordeal and is not yet ready to trust easily, came around by the 3rd day. By the 5th day they were arguing companionably about cattle prices, and Daniel had started calling him Barlow, which Anna understood to be affectionate. On the evening before he was due to leave, Anna and Cornelius walked the south fence line at dusk. The grass was dry and golden, and the sky was enormous and lavender above them, and the cattle moved slowly in the lower pasture. "Tell me about the land commissioner position," she said. "What does it actually mean for where you are?" "It means Wichita is my base," he said, "but the work takes me out into the territory constantly. I was in this area last week anyway, which is how I was able to justify the detour." She looked at him sideways. "The Dawson Ranch is a detour from what exactly?" "From the direct route between here and Wichita," he said, straight-faced. "That is a very long detour." "I find it worthwhile," he said, and his eyes met hers, and she laughed, and the sound of it went out into the wide Kansas sky and disappeared. They stopped at the far corner of the fence line, where the land fell away slightly toward the creek, and you could see the last slice of sun going down behind the hills. She stood and looked at it and thought about her father building this fence, her father checking it in the amber late afternoon, her father's land under her feet. "I used to think coming back here would feel like grief," she said. "When I was in Caldwell, before all of it, I used to lie awake and think that even if I won, being here would hurt too much because of everything I had lost." "And does it?" he asked quietly. "It feels like him," she said, "like being in the same room where someone you loved once lived. It is sad in the way that all beautiful things are a little sad, but it is not painful, it is mostly just his." She paused. "And mine." Cornelius looked out at the last light on the hills. I think that is exactly what he wanted, he said. She turned to look at him. The light was on his face, the same amber light she had thought about in letters, and she thought, here is a man who understands that some things are not about romance or drama or grand declarations. Some things are about standing quietly beside someone while they look at the light and letting them be entirely themselves. Cornelius, she said. Anna, I think I love you, she said. I want you to know that. He was very still for a moment. The evening wind moved through the grass. I have loved you, he said, since you told me that your father taught you to read contracts so you would not be swindled. I did not know what to do with that at the time. She smiled. And now? Now I know what to do with it, he said, and he reached out and took her hand, her work-roughened, capable hand, and held it in the last light of the October evening on her father's land. He asked her to marry him in December. He came back to the ranch 3 weeks before Christmas, this time with official business in the county that was also, she understood, not entirely coincidental. He came to the kitchen on the second evening of his visit while she was making supper, and he stood in the doorway, and she could tell by the quality of his stillness that something was different. She put down the spoon she was holding and turned around. He came forward and took both her hands and looked at her. I know that we are still finding the shape of this, he said, and his voice had a directness she recognized as what he did when something genuinely mattered. I know that you are a woman who does not need saving and does not need managing, and I have no intention of attempting either. I know that you have your land back and you are building something real, and I would not ask you to diminish any of that. What I am asking is something considerably different. She waited. Her heart was doing something emphatic. I am asking if you will build what you are building here with me, he said. Not instead of what you have, but together with it. I want to marry you, Anna. I want to come back to this ranch as someone who belongs here, if you will have me. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Caldwell in August with $40 and a forged deed and a secret sewn into her hem, and a heart made rigid with grief and suspicion, and the particular determination of someone who has been robbed and refuses to accept it. She thought about how that woman had not known she was also lonely. She had not had the space to be lonely with everything else. Yes, she said, without any reservations. He smiled. It was the full version, the one she had seen building in the partial, restrained expressions over months, and it changed his face entirely, softened and opened it, and she thought she could look at that smile for a very long time and not tire of it. He produced a ring from his coat pocket. It was a simple gold band with a small blue stone, turquoise, that he told her he had found at a silversmith in Wichita who worked with stone from the territory. She looked at it in the lamplight and thought that it was exactly right, exactly the kind of thing he would choose, not ostentatious, not generic, but particular and considered. It suits you, he said. It does, she agreed. Daniel, when they told him, shook Cornelius's hand and then pulled his sister into a hug that lasted a considerable time, and when he released her he had the red-eyed, clenched-jaw expression of someone who is trying not to cry visibly and not entirely succeeding. Papa would have liked him, Daniel said gruffly. He would have checked his credentials and interviewed him extensively and then admitted he liked him. Anna laughed. Yes, she said, that is exactly right. They were married the following March, when the Kansas prairie was just beginning to green at the edges, and the sky was the clean, washed blue that comes after a long winter. The ceremony was in the parlor of the Dawson Ranch house, which Anna and Daniel had repaired and repainted over the winter, the walls a warm cream color with the old curtains replaced, and the floors polished, and her mother's small watercolor of the Ohio Valley, where a leaner had grown up rehung above the fireplace. Mr. Finch married them, having gotten himself authorized to do so with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to all legal matters. The Mercer brothers were there, and Lucia and Aldous Rays and their 4 children, and the 2 neighboring families who had become friends over the winter, the Holloways and the Brennan family, whose oldest daughter had taken a shy and earnest liking to Daniel that was clearly mutual and equally clearly driving both of them to distraction. Anna wore her mother's white cotton dress, let out slightly at the shoulders because she had, it turned out, inherited her father's breadth. She carried prairie flowers that Lucia's eldest child, a boy of 9 named Raphael, had gathered in the field that morning with the intensity of a child given an important task. She walked across the parlor floor and stood beside Cornelius Barlow, and they looked at each other in the March light and said the words that meant what they both, in their precise and careful ways, had known they meant for months. After, there was a supper that spilled from the dining room into the kitchen and out onto the porch when the afternoon turned warm enough. Aldous Ray's produced a guitar, which no one had expected, and played 3 songs with a quiet skill that reduced Lucia to happy tears and made the Mercer brothers look at each other with expressions of profound respect. Daniel danced with Margaret Brennan, who was 20 years old and red-haired, and laughed with her whole body, and the look on Daniel's face during that dance was one Anna stored carefully in her memory. Cornelius danced with Anna in the yard in the late afternoon, after the supper, when most of the guests were gathered on the porch in conversation, and the children were running in the lower pasture. He danced badly, which he had admitted in advance with a directness she found charming, and she danced well enough for both of them, and it did not matter in the least. "You are laughing at me," he said. "I am dancing with you," she said. "There is a distinction." "A fine one," he said, but he was smiling. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they moved slowly in the yard, and the prairie stretched out around them in every direction, green and gold and infinite. The first years of their marriage were full in the way that frontier life always was, full of labor and weather and the relentless negotiation of a working ranch, but full also of the specific satisfaction of building something together. Cornelius kept his position with the Land Commissioner's office, which took him into the territory for stretches of 2 and 3 weeks, but he came home with the regularity of a man who has somewhere he genuinely wants to be. When he was home, he was present in the complete sense, not merely physically there but attending, working alongside Anna and Daniel, learning the rhythms of the ranch, becoming over time someone who understood it as well as she did. He was also, she discovered, someone she wanted to talk to about everything. It was not simply that they got along. It was that her mind worked better with his engaged beside it. They argued occasionally, and the arguments were direct and honest and resolved with the same methodical care they had both brought to the documents in Mr. Finch's back room. She was more impulsive than he was. He was more inclined to caution than she preferred. They were, in practical terms, a well-balanced pair, and in other terms, the ones that did not have practical names, something she had not dared hope for when she had stepped off that stage in Caldwell with $40 and her fists clenched. In the spring of 1880, 2 years after the Silver Spur, their son was born. His name was Thomas Cornelius Barlow, after her father and his, and he came into the world on an April morning when the prairie was loud with birds and the light was extraordinary. He was red-faced and furious, and had an immediate, decisive opinion about everything, which Anna felt was appropriate. Cornelius held him in the bedroom of the ranch house while the morning light came through the windows, and his face went through an expression she had never seen on it before, something that had no defense in it at all, something completely open. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. "I am your father." Anna watched him from the bed. She was exhausted and exhilarated and entirely sure that everything she had fought for in the terrible year of 1878 had been, in some way she could not have articulated then, the beginning of this. Daniel came the same afternoon and held his nephew with the expression of a young man being instantly transformed into the kind of uncle who will teach a child everything inadvisable. Margaret Brennan, who had become, after a courtship of 18 months that had involved considerable dancing and at least 2 formal conversations with Daniel about intentions, now Margaret Dawson, came with him and sat beside Anna and held her hand. "He is wonderful," Margaret said. "He is extremely loud," Anna said. "Those are the same thing," Margaret said, and they both laughed. Victor Hale's trial had concluded the previous year. He had been convicted on 14 counts of land fraud, 3 counts of forgery, and 1 count of unlawful imprisonment. He had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison in Leavenworth. The county clerk who had fled Caldwell had been found in Missouri and was tried separately, and received a lesser sentence reflecting his lesser role. The lawyer who had helped file the fraudulent documents had been disbarred and fined. It was not a perfect justice, Anna thought. There was no perfect justice for the years lost, for the fear for her mother. But it was the best the law could do, and she had decided, with the pragmatic clarity that had always been her particular gift, that the best the law could do was worth fighting for. She told Thomas about it when he was old enough to understand. She told him about his grandfather, Thomas Dawson, who had built this ranch from nothing. She told him about the letters in the hem and the county records and the federal judge, and the man she had walked into on the steps of the Caldwell Hotel who had helped her win it back. She told him that his father was, in her considered opinion, the most decent man she had ever known, which was saying a great deal because she had also known his grandfather. Cornelius was present for these conversations more than once, and had the decency to look uncomfortable, which she found entirely endearing. By 1882, the Dawson Ranch, now generally called the Barlow-Dawson property in legal documents, and simply the Dawson Ranch by everyone who lived and worked there, had grown to 900 acres through the careful purchase of adjacent land that came available when an elderly neighbor decided to retire to live with his family in Missouri. The herd was solid. The fences were intact. There was a new barn and a repaired water system, and a kitchen garden that Anna maintained with the same methodical satisfaction she brought to everything she cared about. Daniel and Margaret lived in a separate house they had built on the northwest portion of the property, close enough for daily company, and far enough for the necessary independence of 2 households. Daniel had grown into exactly the rancher their father had been, patient with animals, decisive about the land, and governed by a straightforward moral sense that expressed itself in action rather than speech. He and Cornelius had become, over time, something closer than brothers-in-law usually managed. They worked well together and disagreed productively, and had a shared language of dry humor that Anna had learned to interpret and occasionally participated in. In the summer of 1883, Anna and Cornelius's second child arrived, a girl, whom they named Eleanor Frances Barlow after both their mothers. She arrived in June, quieter than her brother had been, with dark hair and extremely attentive eyes that seemed, in the first weeks of her life, to be observing everything around her with a scientist's focus. "She is going to be difficult to deceive," Cornelius said, looking at his daughter with the same completely undefended expression he had worn at Thomas's birth. "Good," Anna said. "I find honesty preferable." "She already looks like she knows what you are thinking," he said. "She is 4 days old," Anna said. "Exactly," he said. Eleanor grew into exactly the kind of child who proved her father's early assessment accurate. She was curious and precise and entirely unafraid of asking the direct question, which her mother viewed as a virtue in her brother, who was 3 years older, and the kind of boy who thought his plans were more subtle than they were, viewed as a professional hazard. The Rays family continued to thrive. Their land was productive and well-worked, and Aldous had, in the years since the restoration of their title, expanded from cattle into wheat with considerable success. He was a figure of considerable standing in the county now, which was, Cornelius noted to Anna privately, exactly as it should have been all along. Lucia and Anna had developed the warm, frank friendship that had begun in those early days, and the Rays children and the Barlow children grew up in the easy, in-and-out way of children whose families are genuinely close. Mr. Finch remained in Caldwell, where his practice had grown considerably in the years since the Hale case had established his reputation as a man of principle. He came to dinner at the Dawson Ranch several times a year, and was the kind of company that made an evening feel significant. He had argued, with increasing success, for a more consistent application of property law across the territory that would protect homesteaders against exactly the kind of fraud Victor Hale had perpetrated. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that did not produce dramatic moments or visible victories most of the time. But it was real work, and Anna thought about it with the same satisfaction she felt looking at the intact fence line at dusk. One evening in the fall of 1884, 6 years after Caldwell and the silver spur and the letter with $40 in her purse, Anna was standing on the porch of the ranch house in the blue hour after supper. The children were inside. Thomas was 7, engaged in a prolonged and creative negotiation with his father about whether he had to finish his arithmetic before bed, and Alina was 4, already asleep in the way of small children who exhaust themselves completely and then cease to function without warning. Cornelius came out and stood beside her on the porch. He brought 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. They stood in the familiar silence of people who have stood in this particular silence enough times that it no longer needs filling. The Kansas prairie was immense and dark and pricked with stars. There was no sound except the wind in the long grass and a distant coyote calling and the creak of the porch boards. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me in Mr. Finch's back room on that first week? You said, 'We have each other.'" "I remember," he said. "I have thought about that a great deal over the years," she said. "It was a practical statement. You meant it practically." "I meant it practically," he agreed. "And in every other way simultaneously." She looked at him. He was looking out at the dark prairie, and the lamplight from inside touched the side of his face, and she thought, as she had thought 100 times, that she knew this face the way she knew the south fence line, completely and without needing to look. That it was the face she had reached for on a porch in October in the dark and would reach for as long as she had hands. "I love you," she said, "in the complete sense." He looked at her. The storm-gray eyes were very clear and very still. "I love you in the complete sense," he said. "I have from the moment you told me you were protecting yourself with $40 and a forged deed, and I thought, here is someone who will not be beaten." "You thought that in the first 5 minutes." "I thought a great deal in the first 5 minutes," he said. "I kept most of it to myself." She laughed. "You kept most of everything to yourself for quite some time." "I am a cautious man," he said. "You are," she agreed. "It is one of the things about you that I found initially exasperating and now find entirely restful." He smiled. The full version, the one that opened his face completely. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch of the ranch her father had built, and she had fought for and won, in the wide Kansas night, with their children inside and the prairie all around them and the stars doing what they always did, indifferent and permanent and beautiful. And she felt the truth of what she had told him settle into her like something that does not need to move because it has arrived. Inside, Thomas had apparently won his arithmetic negotiation by a method that Cornelius would later describe as technically compliant and substantively evasive. And Alina had been woken by this minor domestic triumph, and had come to the kitchen for water, and had stood in the lamplight with her dark hair disordered, and her eyes 3/4 shut, and asked, with the directness of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that some questions go unasked, "Why are you and Mama standing on the porch in the dark?" "Because the night is beautiful and your mother is extraordinary," Cornelius said. Alina considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to bed. Thomas said from the table where his arithmetic lay half completed, "Is that always what you say?" "Something like it," Cornelius said. "Does it work?" "Ask me in 20 years, Cornelius said. Thomas thought about this and then returned to his arithmetic with the focused resignation of a boy who understands when a discussion is closed. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was long and hard in the way that Kansas winters could be, the kind that tested fences and resolve in equal measure. But the ranch came through it intact, and in the spring there were 17 new calves in the lower pasture, and the kitchen garden was planted, and the south fence line. Anna checked it on the first warm afternoon as she always did, held firm. She stood at the far corner where the land fell away to the creek and watched the light go amber on the hills and thought about her father. She thought about the 20 years he had put into this land, and the fever that had taken him too soon, and the grief that had made her mother vulnerable to the wrong man, and the chain of consequence that had led to a stagecoach in August 1878, and $40 and a secret sewn into a hem. She thought about how none of it had been wasted, how even the terrible parts, the loss and the fraud and the months of fear, had been the road to here. Not that suffering was good, not that, but that people of will and honesty could walk through terrible things and arrive somewhere worth arriving. She heard hoofbeats behind her and turned. Cornelius was riding up along the fence line, Thomas in front of him in the saddle, Eleanor's voice carrying from somewhere behind them where she was riding her own small pony, with the focused concentration she brought to all things physical. He brought the horse up beside her and Thomas said, "Mama, we found a coyote den by the East Creek, but we left it alone like you said." "That is exactly right," she said. "Papa says coyotes are important." "Papa is right." Thomas considered this. "Papa is usually right," he said with the solemn air of someone reporting a scientific finding. "He is," Anna agreed. Eleanor arrived on her pony and looked at the fence line with interest. "Is this the fence you fixed?" she asked her mother. "It is," Anna said. "It looks like a fence," Eleanor said. "It does," Anna said. "That is how you know it is working." Cornelius caught her eye over the children's heads, and she saw in his expression the thing she loved most about him, the thing that had been there from the first afternoon, the quality of being genuinely present, genuinely awake, genuinely here with her. No performance, no hidden motive, no trap, just the clean, honest weight of a man she trusted with everything she had fought to reclaim and everything she had built since. She took hold of his stirrup, just to be touching, and they stood in the amber light of the Kansas afternoon, while their children argued mildly about which way the coyote had gone, and the cattle moved in the lower pasture, and the grass ran in waves to the horizon. The Dawson ranch stood. It was real. It was hers and Daniel's and theirs. It was the children's who would carry it forward into the unwritten years. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought, exactly what her father had always intended, not just land but life in the fullest, richest, most stubbornly intact sense of the word. She looked up at Cornelius. He was already looking at her. "Come home," she said. "Supper is getting cold." "Yes," he said, and reached down, and she took his hand and he lifted her up behind him on the horse, which Thomas found absolutely hilarious, and Eleanor filed away with the expression of someone collecting data. And they rode home together through the amber light to the warmth of the house, and the supper, and the long, full, ordinary, extraordinary evening ahead.